The Kijuju Autonomous Zone is the most terrifying Resident Evil level, and the reason why goes beyond the surface-level aspects of its design, setting, and lore, but more so in the presentation of these concepts, where the dark undertone of these subtle themes take precedence over the infamously controversial premise of the region itself. The grim writing approach paints the history of an exploited remote tribe and blogs the endeavors of a foreigner who got caught in the midst of a civil war, while simultaneously shedding light on the zone's corrupted affairs. And by digging through the crevices of these events, the game reveals its unfiltered depiction of human trafficking, exploitation, greed, tyranny, governmental corruption, and the depraved psyche of individuals, making this daylight nightmare reach uncharted heights in portraying absolute terror.
Resident Evil 5.
Fear is a primal instinct that's embedded in our bodies to provoke a reaction to potential danger. Recognizing a threat would activate this survival instinct, forcing us to take an immediate decision: run, hide, fight, scream, etc. The probability of making the right choice is what initiates stress, where the intensity level of this stress is directly related to the time window we have to make that decision. The less time, the more stress, and it's all dependent on the individual to make the right choice. In video games, this is what differentiates horror from survival horror, the ability to make a choice. But how real is that choice? And I'm not just referring to how good are the technical aspects of the game in providing this choice, but more so about how real is that choice considering it's just a video game, and there is nothing actually dangerous about it. This is where immersion is supposed to play that role, and it's why every horror marketing campaign is trying to sell how immersive their experience is.
The most intense. The most horrifying. It's in your blood.
Because immersion brings you one step closer to reality, where the setting believability play a huge role in controlling the player's experience. Of course, achieving quote-unquote immersion is not a straightforward task, since palpability vastly differs between individuals. In what one finds believable, others find ridiculous. But one universal method that is commonly used to sell the plausibility of a premise is by citing it from real-world events, putting a spin on a real incident or a location. Now, is that immoral or insensitive? Maybe, it's up to you. But is it necessary? Yes. Unless you're going for a paranormal approach, like trying to make a scary haunted doll, which does work for some people, and it's fine, different strokes for different folks. But for the setting of Resident Evil 5 in particular, horror should be unchained, meticulously guided but unchained. Since its fictional premise is already built on touchy grounds, and shying away from these controversial themes would only devoid the game of its purpose, which at its best is authenticating the source of horror. But horror is a broad term, and Resident Evil 5's fear factor is a bit more specific. Stephen King once said that there are 3 types of horror. 1. The gross out. It's the sight of a severed head tumbling down a flight of stairs, or when an unknown slimy green substance splatters against your arm. 2. The horror, as in reference to the unnatural, like spiders the size of bears, or the dead waking up and walking around. 3, and the worst one, is terror. It's when you come home and realize that everything you own is replaced by an exact replica. Unlike horror, where one is able to recognize that there is something obviously unnatural about the dead waking up and walking around, terror has more ambiguity. It's when everyone around is alive and fine, but all of a sudden they collectively start behaving differently. And in this case, by differently I mean primal. A small town in the rural areas of West Africa that is basically disconnected from the rest of the world is about to turn into hell on earth. Witnessing the town's fall to depravity in real time is a foreigner by the name of Adam. Adam is a character created by Capcom as a foreigner who came to work at the underground mines of Kijuju. He uses his own real-life blog to document his daily life in the autonomous zone. And it's kinda weird because the blog had started in the months prior to the game's release, and in nowhere it mentions its correlation to Resident Evil, or even ponder its legitimacy as a work of fiction. At some point, Adam even goes as far as to write, "Everything you are about to read is true," as horrific as it may sound. So you get to see people commenting on Adam's weekly updates, with some are able to catch on and play along, and others left in the dark, distressed about Adam's safety, since he's actively engaging and responding to public comments. But nonetheless, Adam's blogs act as a blueprint for displaying the impending doom of Kijuju, starting off with his settlement to his new home, where he writes, "Hello everyone. Sorry I haven't updated my blog in a while. It's not easy hooking up a computer in Kijuju. I finally got a network connection, so now I can update you all with my exploits as a stranger in a strange land." Adam goes on by describing his tough job as a miner and how he blows off steam by drinking and meeting women. And meeting women is what he's about to be chasing for now, as he glances over a pretty sweet-looking blonde girl in the watering hole. In an effort to learn more about this mysterious blonde girl, Adam discovers that she came here with her boyfriend, although this boyfriend barely shows up if ever. So according to Adam, it's time to save the princess in distress. And little by little, he does get to know her later on. But just after starting to settle in and have something to look forward to, something changes in the air. A strange course of events in the area starts to get unsettling. I saw something pretty disgusting today. I don't know if I can even bring myself to describe it, but I saw a dead dog lying in one of the back streets of Kijuju. Now, I've seen dead animals here and there before, so that in and of itself wasn't so shocking. However, this time the dog was missing its entire head. I don't know who or what decapitated it, but whatever took the dog's head off didn't leave it on the ground. It was just not there. Things only go downhill from here. His drinking buddies get transferred to another site, leaving him alone. Graffiti drawings and bizarre posters are appearing everywhere in the town, with the town's folk starting to get tensed up as if they were to start a revolution. Everyone just stopped being friendly all of a sudden, with a sense of prejudice towards outsiders. Adam even mentions that on a night out with Allison, aka the blonde girl, a guy wearing sunglasses kept shouting things like, "Foreigners should be thrown out of our land and we will take back our town." At this point, Allison gets so freaked out that she tries to pedal back and find her absent boyfriend for a quick getaway. But soon she would realize that escaping is a mere dream. The terror starts when one day Adam wakes up to some ruckus outside. And by ruckus, I mean crowds chanting and angry shoutings. He reluctantly gets out of bed and pulls back the curtain to witness a mass of people gathered in the town's square, stacking these sacks of God knows what. They set the pile alight, exposing the human bodies inside. Adam says, "My heart started beating in my ears. I never thought people cheering could fill me with so much dread." Looking through the crowd, Adam is able to recognize one of his old friends, his drinking buddy that was quote-unquote transferred to another site. It seems like everyone had joined a union that Adam just didn't get the memo for. Well, everyone but Allison, as she randomly starts pounding on Adam's door and informs him that they are starting to break in and drag people on the streets. So she sneaked out and headed for the only other person she knew in the country. But after some time, Adam learns that Allison's brief on the state of the residents is considered a minor inconvenience compared to what's coming up. Because now innocent folk are getting tied up, beaten, and even feasted on. Dogs are getting rabid and ferocious. The town is plagued with rotting corpses and carcasses. The nature of these barbaric acts became so primitive that public beheadings started to take place, all transpiring up in center for Adam to see in real time. As he writes, "My legs gave out and I just collapsed on the floor. Allison ran over to look outside, but I've pulled her away from the window." But apparently Adam's attempts of sheltering Allison from the horrors outside was not enough to keep her around, since she decides to venture out looking for help or a possible escape, leaving Adam to his hideout all alone. Now, if you've played this game, you would know that she wasn't so lucky in practicing either of those options. But as for Adam, he somehow managed to lay low enough for the arrival of the BSAA, which is basically when the game starts. Although it's unclear if he managed to survive furthermore, since his name does come up on the Tricell database for test subjects. This is obviously a long shot, but you decide. What I am actually interested in learning is Adam's apartment location during the outbreak, and by recounting his point of view, it's suggested that his window was close enough to get a clear view of the scaffolding where the executions took place, but far enough to use a binocular to discern specific individuals. So my guess is somewhere around this building or this one. I know I am taking this too seriously, but I'm a bit disappointed that the devs missed out on a very well-needed Easter egg. Maybe we'll see it incorporated in a future remake, along with renovating Adam's blog events on an incognito Reddit user or something along the lines. By learning the full context behind the Kijuju incident, motives and means become clear, and they manage to exhibit the true depravity of these acts. The Ndipaya are an ethnic group that inhabits an uncharted part of West Africa. This sort of isolation holds some resemblance to the real-life tribe known as the Sentinelese, an ancient and indigenous society who are infamous for their hostility towards outsiders, or the lesser-known Korowai tribe who practice cannibalism as a form of punishment and were completely unaware of other people's existence up until the 70s. Similarly, the Ndipaya's origins are ambiguous by design. What is known about the Ndipaya is their discovery of the stairway of the sunflower. This plant produces an RNA virus known as the progenitor that would cause fatal sickness upon exposure. But somehow these quote-unquote toxic properties were only present in a specific setting that was located in the caverns on the edge of the marshlands. Fascinated by the flower's exclusive properties, the Ndipaya started experimenting with it, only for the unlucky individuals to die by the effects of its toxin. Well, until one day, a tribesman was able to survive the poisoning, and as opposed to the plant's usual fatality, the man was granted superhuman strength and intellect, elevating him to the king/god rank of the tribe. And with such leadership, the Ndipaya were able to build an elaborate city that far surpassed its contemporaries in its structures, all designed to act as defense mechanisms for their precious flower, located at the top, in a sun chamber they would call Garden of the Sun. Skipping forward in time to somewhere between the mid to late 1800s, where a scientist by the name of Henry Travis spent 35 years in Africa, documenting the unexplored depths of this remote part of the world. His writings detailed plants, animals, cultures, and of course, the Ndipaya and their magical flower. His life's work was packed in a 72-part encyclopedia that fell on deaf ears and discredited by the scientific community, leading to their commercial failure, prompting Travis to unalive himself as a result of a 2-year-long depression. But his writings had not been lost, as they would catch the attention of an acclaimed eugenics team years later. This team would use his books as a guide for an expedition into the heart of these caverns, where they would spend 3 months scouting for the plant while fighting the Ndipaya, until eventually the flowers were discovered and the progenitor virus was confirmed to exist. This is where things start to take a dark turn. The progenitor's boundless potentials was met with the team's boundless morale, taking extreme measures to secure the Garden of the Sun for their research, as they would hire local mercenaries to seize and permeate the location by using deadly force, mercilessly killing most of the Ndipaya while forcing out the rest. With no official regulations or public security in this secluded part of the world, these brutal acts were carried in the dark. Nonetheless, the progenitor's test results were extraordinarily groundbreaking that the team had founded a mega-corporation that develops the virus as a bioweapon, disguised as a pharmaceutical that researches vaccines for the same virus. This corporation would be known as Umbrella. Inasmuch as Umbrella can be credited for its ghastly impact on the world of Resident Evil, the inhumane horrors of Kijuju go beyond Umbrella's input, and the mass genocide of the Ndipaya tribe would seem like a pitiful fate in comparison to what's ahead. Tricell Inc. Africa is a multi-industrial conglomerate that houses 3 sectors: pharmaceutical, shipping, and natural resources. They own various assets in the region, ranging from oil and mining fields to laboratories and stock market. In other words, Tricell have a pretty sizable impact on the West African economy. This automatically qualifies them to some sort of a governmental protection, more specifically protection from the FPC, the Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies, which Tricell is a big funder of. And so, when Tricell got the chance to expand their portfolio by entering the bioweapons market, nothing was holding them back. They were able to get this opportunity by getting their hands on confidential data regarding the progenitor virus, and with such deep ties, their pharmaceutical sector was able to carry out field tests with no boundaries. And who is a better test subject than an uncharted indigenous tribe residing in an isolated remote area? The Ndipaya were deceived into taking the Plaga Type 3 injection, which was presented to them as a vaccine. The logic behind what this scenario alludes to is a perfect example of the game's grim writing approach. I mean, how did an indigenous tribe who are particularly hostile towards outsiders were somehow tricked into taking a sketchy vaccine so easily? It sounds improbable, but the dark reality is that a lot of these remote parts in Africa lack access to the most important and primary vaccines, like the polio and hepatitis B vaccines, or more region-specific ones like the yellow fever and malaria injections. And what the Ndipaya thought would help their life expectancy did the exact opposite and perished every woman and child in the tribe, as the Type 3 Plaga have a 0% adherence rate to these groups. And if you've ever wondered, this is why you don't encounter any female Ndipayas through the game. But as for the adult males, the Type 3 Plaga was able to activate their progenitor powers. And by progenitor, I'm not just referring to the virus, but the literal meaning of the word, since the hosts started reverting to their ancestral practices of painting themselves in ceremonial war paint and channeling their primal self-preservation instincts. Where the massive presence of human skulls and rib cages indicates the NDPI's ritualistic murders of the non-hosts who refused to take the injection. For Tricell, on the other hand, this experiment would prove to be successful in showcasing the unleashed powers of the Type 3 Plaga to the potential buyers. But while the Type 3 Plaga has outstanding results in constructing a superhuman army, it faces a minor drawback in confining the privacy of its subjects. In other words, the infected individuals are too far gone to have a chance of being established as ordinary citizens. Aside from the fact they are non-negotiable killing machines, their physical attributes of strength, stamina, and build are instantly recognizable as mutant forms. Now, this wouldn't cause any stir in the uncharted areas of the marshlands where the NDPI's reside, but on the more civilized city side of Kijuju, these public tests needed more subtlety. And so, this is where the Type 2 Plaga comes into play. While inferior in terms of its raw potentials to the Type 3 Plaga, the Type 2 accommodates for the host's self-control, granting them the desired biological superiorities while retaining some self-awareness to help them run their errands. As a biological weapon, this variation was marketed as a tool for crowd control, with an exhibition campaign conducted on the city residents of Kijuju. Of course, a civil war would break out, leading to the overthrow of the government, announcing Kijuju as a self-governed zone. On the suspicion of ongoing black market bioweapon tradings, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, in short BSAA, would send their agents to investigate the region. And this is where things start to get a bit tangled, so bear with me. You see, I've mentioned previously that Tricell is a big funder of the Federation of the Pharmaceutical Companies. But after Umbrella was indicated in the instigation of the Raccoon City destruction incident through illegally developing biological weapons, the Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies was quickly disgraced, as people began to distrust many of the organizations that made up the Federation, thanks to Umbrella's own place as a senior member of the FPC. The organization's reputation was damaged further when it became apparent that Umbrella was using its fellow medical corporations as suppliers for chemicals that Umbrella used for its bioweapons program. The FPC and Tricell willingly handed over documents regarding their dealings to be used against Umbrella, after it was agreed that they themselves would not be investigated further. And after Umbrella lost the Raccoon trials, the FPC began to restore its image by founding and funding the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, and Tricell was soon a major funder of this organization. So when the BSAA headquarters sent their agents to investigate the zone, they've purposely neglected to inform them about the rampant Plaga infestation, and the team had to discover the connection firsthand.
Who do you think got this entire operation off the ground? Research like this doesn't fund itself, you know.
This interconnection would be demonstrated furthermore by revealing that the CEO of Tricell, Excella Gione, was the one who ordered the BSAA team's retreat in an attempt to conceal Tricell's connection.
Although, weren't you two given orders to retreat?
So it was you!
Now, there are deeper layers to these affairs that induct Wesker's primary role as the perpetrator of the Kijuju incident, where almost everything I've mentioned is a small pawn in his grand scheme of funding his Ouroboros project. But these entanglements are a bit too broad for the scope of this video. So, taking a step back to the present timeline of the game, which depicts the arrival of Chris and Sheva, confronted by the aftermath of these previously disclosed events, while simultaneously coinciding with the conclusion of Adam's ordeals. It sets the game for a forlorn experience. In other words, Chris represents an outsider that embodies the player's sense of being secluded in a foreign land, with terror waiting around every corner, only for that sense of remote isolation to be quickly nullified by the presence of Sheva. Sheva's presence contextually deprives the game of its unease factor. And what I mean is her influence on the game goes beyond her gameplay companionship, where she is fighting and exploring alongside Chris, although that in and of itself negatively provides a safer space for the player in terms of atmosphere and a huge burden in terms of gameplay. But on a deeper level, she eases up the atmosphere by her familiarity with the zone as a native, depriving the game contextually from much more peculiar solo encounters. And you might be wondering, since her incorporation heavily impacts the game in a negative way, why couldn't the developers build the game as a solo experience, or at least give the players a choice to go solo? Well, by taking a look at the game's original E3 trailer, it's obvious that the game was supposed to be a solo experience, with a more specific racial homogeneity, at least in terms of skin color. So what happened? Why couldn't we get the evidently superior E3 version of the game? Well, as the game journalists would phrase it back then, a white man gunning down hordes of black African natives. Which is a ridiculous narrative to try and push, since Capcom adopted the same approach in rural Spain with their previous game. And I know that the historical connotations played a part in this case, but even then, the game's context refutes a lot of these misconceptions. Case in point, the public's criticism of the Indie Paya's stereotypical depiction as remote natives wearing basic garbs around their body-painted waists and using spears as weapons, portraying them as primal savages. Well, no. The Type 3 Plaga de-evolutions them into that state. It's the main premise of the game's lore. But it's easy to look at the visual representation and make an uninformed narrative, which people did.
You are so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
Causing Capcom to push back with heavy alterations to the game's original direction, with the biggest being the introduction of Sheva as a playable native alongside Chris, rather than her earlier position in the game as an NPC, alleviating some of the public tension by diversifying the main shooters basically. And in these culturally sensitive times, I doubt Capcom would ever regress to the game's original direction in a future remake, which is unfortunate, since shying away from these taboo elements will dry the game out of its shock factor that the setting heavily relies on, leaving players with the Alone in Africa mod to get a glimpse of the game's intended vision by letting the players experience a solo version of the game. And if in the chronologically expected remake, Capcom decided to take a similar route to the mod and adhere to their fans by addressing and transposing the original's watered-down experience, it's bound to receive criticism. But in a time where the AAA space is getting stale by being afraid to take creative risks that would evolve and push the boundaries of the medium, taking the extra steps is almost necessary to metamorph the game into its grand form and be able to leave an impact, as much as culturally shocking it may be. I know this is not the safest or even the smartest direction to take for an $8 billion franchise, but all I'm asking for is at least integrate these dark themes in subtlety. I'm okay with subtle, as long as it exists. But until then, I'll be sitting here trying my absolute hardest to become the first guy who's made an entire Resident Evil 5 video without referencing a certain sequence. And fail.